Welcome to The Explainer. If you want to understand what makes one of the world's most unique democracies tick, you are absolutely in the right place. Today, we're unpacking the incredibly rich, often surprising history of Australia, looking specifically at how it's framed in a recent documentary narrated by former Prime Minister Tony Abbott. We're going to break down this massive historical timeline into a really structured narrative based entirely on that source material. This story, it is packed with wild twists, deep tragedies, and just remarkable resilience. So get comfortable and let's jump right in. The documentary's big idea is that modern Australia was born from a profound collision and eventual fusion of two totally different worlds. Just think about that stark contrast for a second. You've got this ancient landscape that's been inhabited for tens of thousands of years, and then boom, the sudden arrival of 18th century European naval power and penal colonies. The core argument here really hits the nail on the head. The new post-1788 Australia didn't just pop up out of thin air. It was built right on top of a deep, pre-existing history. To really get the nation today, the source argues, we have to understand this foundational clash and the complex coexistence that slowly followed. To make sense of over 60,000 years of history, we're going to follow a chronological roadmap. 1. The ancient foundation. 2. Convex, conflicts, and gold. 3. Federation and the wars. 4. Building a migrant nation. And 5. The modern democracy.
Let's start with part 1, the ancient foundation, 60,000 years of Indigenous heritage. To really grasp Australia's timeline, we have to stretch our minds back a staggering 60,000 years. The documentary takes us up to Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory, looking at Aboriginal origins and rock art that could be 50,000 years old. I mean, to put that into perspective, that art predates the pyramids of Giza by tens of thousands of years. But it's not just some old relic. It represents the Jukurba, or the dreaming. Think of the dreaming as this incredibly complex, overarching spiritual law that mapped out creation stories, social rules, and literally the survival knowledge needed for an intensely harsh landscape. The Indigenous people essentially read the land like a giant library. When you look at the 1788 arrival, the documentary really emphasizes just how incredibly recent the British presence actually is compared to the vast, vast history of the world's oldest continuous living culture.
Moving right along to part 2, convicts, conflicts, and gold, the collision of two worlds.
Okay, imagine stepping onto a cramped, creaky wooden ship, knowing you are leaving everything you've ever known behind for 250 days. That's exactly how long it took 11 tall ships, carrying about 1,500 souls, including over 800 convicts, to travel 17,500 nautical miles. Just try to picture the sheer sensory overload there, the smell, the fear, the intense claustrophobia. They were crossing these perilous, totally uncharted waters with just the stars to guide them, eventually dropping anchor in Sydney Harbor. The documentary points out that arriving in this completely unknown environment must have felt pretty much like landing on Mars. These convicts were essentially dumped halfway across the globe just to relieve overflowing English prisons during the Industrial Revolution. It was an incredibly grim, unpromising start for what the narrator eventually calls an unexpected success story. The documentary reveals this tragic, really stark disconnect between London's official orders and the brutal reality that was actually unfolding on the frontier. Governor Arthur Phillip had strict instructions from the Crown to live in amity and kindness with the native people, but on the ground, rapid, unregulated pastoral expansion told a completely different story. The source tackles the violent reality of settlers pushing out into Indigenous lands, specifically highlighting the 1838 Mile Creek Massacre. This was a horrifying event where 28 Aboriginal men, women, and children were murdered. But the documentary also frames this as a major legal turning point. It notes that Mile Creek led to the very first time white men were tried and actually hanged for the murder of Aboriginal people. It's presented as this ultimate, if delayed, triumph of British justice over racist brutality, even right in the middle of a deeply flawed and violent frontier. So how on earth did a struggling penal colony transform into a booming economy? Well, the source points to 3 massive catalysts. First off, the sheer resilience of the emancipists. These were freed convicts who got tickets of leave once their sentences were up. Suddenly, a former pickpocket from London could build a business or own land, planting the very first seeds of that famous Australian egalitarianism. Second was the merino wool boom. millions of sheep were bred to feed Britain's hungry industrialized textile mills, and that generated immense wealth. And third, the explosive 1850s gold rush. The sheer volume of gold unearthed was absolutely mind-boggling. It literally quadrupled the population almost overnight. This massive influx of fortune seekers brought all these new demands for fair taxation and political representation, which culminated in the famous Eureka Stockade Rebellion. The documentary actually frames that rebellion as a foundational, bloody struggle for Australian democratic rights.
Now for part 3, Federation and the Wars, Forging a National Identity. You know, before 1901, Australia wasn't actually a unified country at all. It was a collection of fiercely rival colonies. They were so competitive, they built internal trade walls. And get this, they even used different-sized train tracks. So passengers crossing state borders literally had to get off one train and board another just because the tracks didn't match. Insane, right? But driven by visionary leaders like Sir Henry Parkes and Alfred Deakin, they realized they had to unite. They needed to tear down those trade walls and deal with shared defense fears in an increasingly dangerous world. But the crucial takeaway the documentary highlights here is how this Commonwealth was born. Unlike the US or South Africa, there was no bloody war of independence. It was achieved through a remarkably peaceful decade of democratic debate, constitutional conventions, and a vote of the people. It was a true global anomaly.
Once they united, the new nation's identity was immediately put to the test on the global stage. The documentary traces this massive shift in military reliance over a few decades. First, the nation's loyalty was tested in the trenches of Gallipoli in 1915. Australian volunteers fought and died out of this deep loyalty to the British Empire, forging the enduring Anzac legend. But then, 1942 brought a terrifying wake-up call with the fall of Singapore during World War II. The source describes this as the exact moment Australia realized the British Empire just couldn't protect it anymore from the rapidly advancing Japanese forces in the Pacific. That existential threat forced Prime Minister John Curtin to make a radical, historic pivot. He turned away from Britain to forge a strict, enduring alliance with the United States to secure the region, an alliance that stands to this very day.
On to part 4, Building a Migrant Nation, Populate or Perish. Exiting the trauma of the World Wars, Australia realized it needed hands to secure this massive, relatively empty continent. That led to a conscious national pivot. They slowly started dismantling the old White Australia policy and began embracing mass migration. The documentary perfectly illustrates this third pillar of the nation using both macro-level achievements and some incredible micro-stories. For instance, post-WW2 European migrants arrived and provided the grueling labor needed to build huge infrastructure projects, like the Snowy Mountain Scheme, literally diverting rivers right through mountains. Then, moving into the 1970s, Asian refugees fleeing conflict arrived seeking safety. The source highlights Dai Lei, who went from surviving a harrowing Vietnamese refugee camp to successfully becoming a federal member of parliament. And of course, global immigrants enrich the culture, beautifully captured by the story of Lee Kan Sing, famous as Mao's last dancer, who chose the artistic freedom of Australia over communist China. The source really frames this huge influx of millions of people from over 150 countries, not as a dilution of Australian identity, but as a profound enhancement of it. The idea shared at modern citizenship ceremonies says it all. Integrating into Australia's democratic society is framed as a reciprocal agreement. It's a two-way street. Take a second to think about how that philosophy compares to how immigration is debated in other parts of the world today. The documentary strongly emphasizes that being Australian isn't about your bloodline or where you were born. It's entirely about the shared democratic values you commit to live by that make you part of the national fabric. And finally, part 5. The Modern Democracy, Civilizing Capitalism, and Continuous Reform. The narrator argues that Australia's unique egalitarian balance, what they call the idea of civilizing capitalism, didn't just happen by accident. It's actually the direct result of a really dynamic political tug-of-war. It's this alternating pendulum swing of conservative and progressive reforms over the decades. You've got Robert Menzies in the 50s and 60s vastly expanding homeownership and pushing the middle class forward. Then there's the landmark, incredibly uniting 1967 referendum where over 90% of Australians overwhelmingly voted to finally count Indigenous people in the census. After that, the pendulum swings to Gough Whitlam in the 70s, who introduced sweeping progressive changes like universal health care. And later on, the Labour governments of Hawke and Keating stepped up to float the dollar and thoroughly modernize the global economy. So rather than tearing the country apart, these competing, passionate visions continually course-corrected the nation toward both prosperity and fairness. So, tying it all together, the source concludes that despite its incredibly harsh beginnings, its undeniable dark chapters of frontier conflict, and its pretty intense political growing pains, the nation is ultimately an unexpected success story. And that success? It is entirely built on the convergence of three distinct pillars: the deep spiritual grounding of an indigenous heritage, the robust democratic institutions derived from its British foundation, and the dynamic, relentless energy of its immigrant character. It really is a testament to overcoming massive hurdles to build a truly cohesive society. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought to ponder. We've seen exactly how these three historical pillars were built and how they intersect. But as global tensions rise, as economies rapidly shift, and as society evolves ever faster, will these three foundations hold the nation steady? Or will the pressure force a completely new foundation to be built? Thanks so much for joining me to explore this fascinating documentary today. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I will see you in the next explainer.